Eric Kandel is here. He is a Nobel Prize recipient, a professor and medical investigator at Columbia University. You might also know him as a co-host of the Charlie Rose Brain series, which is now in its second season. For years, he has been interested in the unconscious processes of the human brain. He explores this topic in a new book about how the science of the mind engages with art. The book is called The Age of Insight. I am pleased to have Dr. Eric Kandel back at this table where he comes frequently. Welcome. Good to have you here.
Nice of you to have me here, Charlie.
The Age of Insight. Why call it the Age of Insight?
Vienna 1900 was a very special period in which our view of humankind was altered. Before that, there was a view of human beings as being essentially rational creatures, specially created by God. This was the view of the Enlightenment, to be different from all other animal species. And then Darwin came along and documented how we evolved from simple ancestors and made us realize that there's a continuity in evolution. And the Viennese extended this to pointing out that the human mind is also complicated and not completely rational. There are many irrational components. And the idea of an important aspect of the mind being unconscious mental processes, instincts that control our behavior, emerged in 1900 and emerged from several different influences that I tried to describe here.
Just a bit of history, because it is Vienna, and Vienna is a place that you lived until age 9?
That's right.
What's amazing about this for me, and so then you and your brother left on a boat alone.
That's right.
Your mother had the foresight.
Extraordinary.
To feel the fear.
That's right.
And say, early on, work on the visa deal.
Right. And what amazes me is that I was a pretty anxious child, and yet she was able to reassure both me and my brother that everything would be fine. Imagine, at my age, crossing the Atlantic by ourselves. It's amazing, amazing. Yeah.
There's an extraordinary film about this, which is a documentary about your life that captures this. It's also, I take note of, this book is dedicated to the delightful Denise, who deserves it. But what is the role here, as you started to say, of Vienna, this Vienna that you love, because it was the highest, probably the highest representation of intellectual
modern intellectual life.
Sigmund Freud was there.
Absolutely. On many levels. To begin with, medicine was fairly primitive until 1800. And then in the aftermath of the French Revolution, French medicine began to be scientific. By 1850, Viennese medicine became the dominant force. So it really introduced scientific medicine into clinical practice. And this was led by a guy called Rokitansky, who is the major driving force in the theme of modernism, in my thinking. He was the one that realized that the only way you can make sense out of a clinical examination is to correlate the clinical findings with what you see at autopsy. He said, truths are hidden from the surface. You have to go deep below the skin to find it. Freud was in Vienna School of Medicine in the late stages of Rokitansky's career, and this was the driving theme of his career. You can't simply accept a patient's expression of their illness, psychological description of the illness, as being the only cause of it. You have to go deep into unconscious motivation. And everyone was influenced by the idea that there are things below the surface that you don't see. The painters that I describe in this book, who also developed insights into the unconscious mental processes, didn't want to just paint pretty pictures. They wanted to see, what is Charlie Rose thinking? What's going on in that great mind behind the face? To go deep into it. And you see this at every point along the way.
You have said before, it is the central challenge of science in the 21st century. The central challenge of science in the 21st century is to understand the brain in biological terms. And that's the journey you took yourself.
Yes.
It began.
Yes, yes. And that we are taking in this series.
And doing a series.
Right.
And it's also here, in a sense, connecting the unconscious.
Exactly.
With art.
Right.
And the creative expression. And understanding creativity as something.
One thing, this is actually characteristic of what you do and what we try to do together, is to treat science as part of the intellectual enterprise. Why should science be less interesting than golf baseball or tennis. It's an extremely interesting intellectual activity, and somehow people are frightened away from science because they think it's difficult. But if you take the pains to explain it, it can be understood by everyone. And what I try to do is bridge between science and the humanities with a specific example, that of Viennese artists of 1900.
Yeah. I mean, this basic thread running through it all is this sort of interdisciplinary attempt to understand the unconscious, too.
Right. And there was another thing that
as it affects not only the person who creates art, but also the person who observes it.
That's a very good point. I mean, what emerged from students who began to try to put this together, Alois Riegel, Ernst Gombrich, whom you interviewed
who I
here.
did. The wonderful Ernst
Wonderful.
Gombrich. One of the great art historians of our time.
But he pointed out that when you look at a painting, you are involved in a creative act.
Right.
What makes a work of art great is ambiguity.
Right.
That you and I see somewhat different things. And the reason we do it is because each of us brings different experiences and a different brain to bear. And we reconstruct the image that we see in our own head.
Mm-hmm. What do you want us to understand here about the unconscious?
That it is a tremendous influence on both the artist and on the beholder, and that we're beginning to understand how people use both their conscious and unconscious mental processes to respond to a work of art. We can outline a scheme of the various steps that are involved in looking at a great painting and having a perceptual response, an emotional response, an empathic response to it. Mm-hmm. And we can outline in principle how this occurs. There are a lot of details that have to be filled out, but this is an initial attempt to try to bridge art and brain science.
Has there been a time where there was a place like Vienna since then? Is that New York today?
Florence during the Renaissance was like this.
Right.
But what was unusual about Vienna, probably also true in Florence, is the fact that the artists and the scientists spoke to one another, and that the historians spoke to both of them, and the writers spoke to them all. And they focused on common themes. I mean, Schnitzler, who's a writer, develops ideas very similar to Freud. Kokoschka, who's a painter, develops ideas similar to Freud. They all try to deal with this new idea.
But Freud also, as you have suggested, viewed, he sort of viewed art as a means to understand the unconscious.
Yes. He did understand, but he didn't quite know how to approach it. He thought the best way to try to bring art and science together is to try to analyze the artist. He tried to do this with Leonardo. He tried to do this a little bit with Michelangelo. But these guys were dead. How are you going to try to get insight into how their mind worked? What the School of Art History, people like Riegel, Gombrich, and Chris did, was to analyze the living beholder.
Right.
How do they respond to art? And that is a terrific approach to bridging art and science, because you can really do experiments to see how do we respond to illusions. And what most people didn't realize at the time is that the information we take in is a fraction of what's out there. So we don't really reconstruct. We reconstruct. We don't see reality as it is. We reconstruct it in our own brain. The brain is a creativity machine. And so there are rules that determine how things are put together. Those are inborn. But in addition, we have what is called top-down processing. We have memories of previous experience, of people we've seen, works of art we've seen, and we use that to compare what's coming in with what we've experienced before. So there's a rich creative process going on that they could begin to describe in some detail.
But are you more interested, in, for example, in the artist, the creativity of the artist and the unconscious of there, or are you more interested in someone like yourself who appreciates art, who has, quote, the beholder's stare?
I'm interested in both. I'm a scientist, as you well know, and I've tried to take a somewhat different approach than an art historian might take. I've taken a reductionist approach to this, and that is a reductionist takes a large problem that they like and takes a simple example of it and tries to understand it deeply.
Right.
So I simplified my task in two ways. One is I focused on a limited aspect of art, only portraiture, because we have a terrific understanding of the face, and two, only these three painters. And then Alois Riegel helped me because he pointed out, again in a reductionist step, that the way to understand how art and science can be bridged is to focus on the beholder. There are lots of things he could have picked on, but focusing on how you and I respond to works of art gives us a tractable problem.
What's the biological aspect of this?
There are people who have problems with different aspects of the beholder share.
Right.
In the simplest case, you can be face blind,
right.
so you can't see portraits at all,
right.
okay? So we know the regions that are involved in that. They're in the temporal lobe. Or you can be autistic. So you might see the painting perfectly well, but you don't respond emotionally to it because you can't put yourself in another person's place. So at different points along the line, we have a pretty good beginning of a biology of things because we've seen disorders interfere with one or another function. Right. You yourself pointed out we've learned an enormous amount about normal functioning from disorders, and that's the case with the beholder share as well.
Yeah. Ever since I have known you, we have talked about, this C.P. Snow.
Right.
This central question.
Right.
Of the relationship between the humanities and science.
Right.
You are a scientist who loves the humanities, yes?
And I love trying to discuss science with non-scientists. And so one of the driving forces for me is to try to get people interested in seeing the bridge between science and the humanities, to realize that knowing a little bit about how facial perception works
right.
and how empathy works enriches your understanding of how you respond to art. I think that in the long run, as we know more and more about the biological process involved and how people respond to art, it's not only going to help you enjoy works of art more, but it may even help the artist. Look, Leonardo da Vinci dissected human bodies,
right.
so he could see how the muscles exactly attack. So as you learn about the body, he could do a more realistic depiction.
Right.
As we understand the mind in biological terms, artists may get insights that will really alter the way they depict the psychological sensibility of people.
What's different about that than any other artist who tries to look at the natural world, and figure out how it is and to observe it so well that they can capture it in a defining way? Well,
I think all artists are psychologists in a way. They try to get an insight into how a person is functioning and depicting it. With time, both art form and the insights people have evolved. So modern artists have additional insights. They may not necessarily have Leonardo's skill, but they have new ideas about how the human mind functions that they bring to bear on it. So, artists have great insights into the functioning of people, which they depict.
Right. Now, when you look at scientists, do you think that scientists and artists differ? Do they differ in some fundamental way in how they make sense out of the world?
I think there probably are commonalities to the creative process in scientists and artists. We don't know that, but it's quite likely to be that way.
Here's what I love. This is your mentor, Harry Grunfest, who said to you, quote, "If you want to understand the brain, you're going to have to take a reductionist approach, one cell at a time."
There is, and this is wonderful, because what do expressionist artists do? They exaggerate things. They bring out the emotion by slightly distorting how that emotion is conveyed. We now know that in this region that gives rise to face perception, there are clusters of cells called face patches in which single cells respond to a face. So there's a single cell that responds to Charlie Rose. Right. If you make a cartoon of a person,
right,
the cell responds to it. But one of the things we know about faces is...
If you make a cartoon, the cell responds.
Right.
In the same way?
More dramatically. If you exaggerate the cartoon, push the eyes apart, or make a single eye, the cells go wild.
Really?
So built into the brain is the capability of responding to exaggeration, which is what the artist captured independently.
What artists do.
Yeah.
I always end brain series questions by saying, what's the big question? So what is the question that we most want to answer in the pursuit of this bridge?
We want to understand in detail, how do different neural circuits get involved in responding to a work of art?
Right.
There is an enormous recreation that is involved in your brain when you look at a work of art. If we understand that, we will understand an enormous amount about perception. Let me give you an example. You look at a painting, it's two-dimensional. And yet if the artist is successful, you get a tremendous sense of depth if he wants to create perspective. Right. Shows your face, you see it as if it's sculpted, okay? But the brain knows, even though it's recreating this, that it's a flat surface in a painting. And I'll give you a good example. If you have a painting of a person that is made with the artist looking at the subject's eyes, and it's hanging on this wall, and you walk around the painting, the eyes follow you. You must have had that experience many times, okay? If you put a sculpture there and walk around it, the eyes don't follow you. Because the brain knows this is a sculpture, the eyes don't follow you, but it realizes the painting is a fiction. Yeah. It's a two-dimensional. So this is wonderful to realize how much the brain really unconsciously knows about what's going on, compensates for it, and gives you the sense, but boy, this is really a three-dimensional structure, knowing on one level that it's two-dimensional.
The Age of Insight, the quest to understand the unconscious in art, mind, and brain, from Vienna, 1900 to present. Thanks to Eric Kandel, my friend. Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you, Charlie.